It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. There was an American who came to the city and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I think is what he said. And I understand that he called himself a jelly-filled donut or something to that effect. All I'll say is it's nice to be here in your beautiful city. Thanks for the welcome. We have, I think, a great 2 days ahead of us with lots of topics covering different parts of the world, different parts of market access, reimbursement and pricing, as well as in the other track. So I'm excited to join in the day with you all. So I'm going to be speaking to you about ways to navigate what's becoming a more complex environment to make sure that patients can have access to our therapies in a timely manner. So I have two main topics that I'll talk about, just a very quick overview of how I see today's landscape evolving, and then basically ways to be successful in it. So first of all, one of three themes that I'll talk about is regulatory variation. We see obviously differing requirements across countries, changing rules related to artificial intelligence, and AI, I think, is a topic that you'll hear about multiple times today. Not necessarily to be its cheerleader and to buy into what might be hype in some cases, but to talk realistically about what it's helping us achieve and what we expect it to help us achieve in the future. And we also see, for instance, in the US, where I've obviously come from, government shutdowns, where new drug applications aren't even being accepted right now, as well as short staffing in not only the FDA, but also the NIH, where a lot of the basic science research comes from. So this is one challenge that all of us are facing. Another challenge is that budget holders and manufacturers, we've been noticing on the service provider side, are tightening their belts a little bit. Not every manufacturer, not in all cases, but we see different policies from different parts of the world, like most favored nation status, which I think you'll hear about from other speakers during the conference, Medicare price negotiation in the US. 3 years ago, here in this country, obviously, you had a change of free pricing from 12 to 6 months. So all over the world, we see budget holders guarding their budgets more jealously. Even if we see European countries technically increasing list prices to sort of play ball a little bit with what's coming out of the US in terms of most favored nation, what we might see is just increasing rebates and kind of a strategic counter move. In the US, we obviously have lots of efforts to try and rein in drug spending by the current administration. And finally, HTA agencies' demands are growing. Here in this part of the world with the EU HTA initiative, in my part of the world, we have a growing influence of ICER, and we have US payers talking about cost effectiveness to an extent that they really never did before, even if they say they don't make formulary decisions based on it. So confronted by this set of challenges, the question is, what can we do? So the first thing in terms of timeline is very early. We can think about how to get our drugs to patients before regulatory approval. So by a show of hands, for the people from the manufacturer side, how many of you are responsible for a drug that treats a serious illness, a serious life-threatening illness, where patients may run out of standard of care options? Just by a show of hands. Okay, so a fair representation. So for you, managed or early access programs may be a way to get your drug to patients in cases where they can't get access, let's say in a clinical trial or in a commercialized context. And in some cases, and I'll present to you a case study in a minute, deliver evidence for reimbursement. So there are three access routes, three ways by which a patient can get a drug. One is clinical trials, one is unlicensed access, where a drug is globally unlicensed, but it may be licensed in one part of the world, let's say the FDA, in the US has licensed it, and then a patient may be able to get access to it in another part of the world, let's say a country in the Middle East, for instance, that recognizes FDA approval. And then the commercial route. So on the In terms of definitions, pre-commercial, non-trial access, basically we can refer to it as managed access. And there are basically lots of different routes. I'm not going to try and pronounce the French, but you've got sort of compassionate use, and you have early access. In France, you have different regulatory routes. In other countries, depending on which country you're in, it's called different things, like a CUP or expanded access. And what all these things have in common is it's not in a trial and it's not commercialized. It's kind of in that gray area in the middle. And basically how it works is the patient needs the drug, the healthcare professional requests it from the health authority and from the pharmaceutical company or its partner, if the pharma company has partnered with an organization to distribute the drug. Then there's a patient approval through an ordering platform where the doctor has submitted the request. And then through a global distribution network that the pharmaceutical company or biotech has or its partner has, the drug gets to the patient and the doctor, it's administered, and then there may or may not be reimbursement. Depends on the country, depends on the context. And there are lots of questions you have to ask in this context. For instance, is providing this drug the right thing to do for patients? Will my product even qualify for managed access? Is it for a serious disease with an unmet need? And so forth. Will the access be reimbursed? And if so, where will it be reimbursed, for whom? And with what potential knock-on effects? Meaning, commercially, is it a good idea for my company to actually provide access to this early? Because it creates a series of domino effects afterwards. It's not like the patient is going to receive the drug and then all of a sudden the patient is not going to receive it, let's say in the case of a non-one-time therapy. Although we have a lot of one-time therapies in this context, we also have chronic therapies like enzyme replacement and so forth. So what happens when a company is basically making itself accountable for this patient's treatment? What happens if the product is not eventually approved? And there are all kinds of issues around pricing. How do you price the product in one of these early access programs, and with what knock-on effects? So from a commercial strategy perspective, there are a lot of things to think about before you enter into one of these early access programs, beyond the obvious first question of, is it the right thing to do for patients? As an example of one strategy you might come up with once the FDA has granted accelerated approval, which happens in a lot of these cases, you might have the ability to get the drug to patients in Saudi Arabia, as well as UAE and Singapore. You may be able to initiate managed access elsewhere, for instance, continuing unlicensed supply in some parts of Latin America and seeking regular approval in the typical countries here in Europe, in the UK and Brazil. And then you go through full commercialization in the typical suspects, but it may be commercially best for the company to actually just continue unlicensed supply in other parts of the world. It may be best commercially, it may be best from a price perspective, for instance, through price referencing elements. So I mentioned there'd be a case study regarding, just looking at my time here. I mentioned there'd be a case study regarding a product that was able to secure reimbursement largely because it had an early access program. So the example here is a product called Orfacol for a genetic liver enzyme deficiency, very rare disease. And here, what happened was the product was basically part of a basically hospital special request program, so an early access program for over a decade. And then it was part of a named patient basis ATU, or temporary use authorization, and I should have mentioned this was in France. And that was put in place for 15 patients. And what was found through all this evidence gathered over basically 20 or more years was that none of the patients treated with this product required a liver transplant, whereas historical controls typically needed liver transplant. And this product not only got an SMR of important, which you would expect, but an ASMR of 1, which, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, as the highest rating in France, is very, very rare. So there are obviously cases where the early access route can lead to a product's success. So when it comes to designing managed access programs, I won't go through all the details here for the sake of time, although you'll have access to the slides if it's of interest. But the general principles are the data collection protocol for an early access program needs to align closely to the pivotal trial design. The worst thing, obviously, that could happen is that the RCT or whatever clinical trial design you have and the early access data that you collect actually say different things. So that alignment in design is super important. And it also is a unique opportunity in early access to basically get more information about the patient pathway, which helps you strengthen the value proposition for the product in a specific country. So we covered early access, and now thinking ahead to commercialization stage and getting ready for that, thinking about evidence generation strategy and optimizing your value prop with evidence planning tools. Basically, there's two elements here. It's developing credible evidence and doing it for the right audiences. Each piece of evidence has to be designed with the audience in mind for basically an integrated value prop across the life cycle. So kind of thinking across space and across time in your evidence generation strategy is key. So I'm going to bring in artificial intelligence now, not to kind of feed into the hype, but because we've actually found it really useful and our clients are finding it really useful in a part of this process, which is this first part here of information review to identify value drivers, evidence gaps, and unmet needs. And here you're trying to anticipate and adapt to basically dynamics in the system, whether they're regulatory or competitive, et cetera, to define your target value proposition. Then you have product value demonstration to generate credible evidence. This is your evidence generation strategy. You have evidence generation recommendations coming out of that to prioritize your evidence. And then you have dissemination. The key about AI, I think, is that in the upper left-hand quadrant, the northwest quadrant, this is where we're finding what I'm calling a curated AI platform. The curation basically consists of this first step of making sure that what you're feeding into the AI platform or model is basically overlooked by people who know what the model should be drawing from and know what it shouldn't be drawing from. This is how we've found you can basically eliminate or minimize to the extent we can these days the hallucinations that these models sometimes produce. And so basically having the experts in the area that you're talking about involved in the what data is the model actually pulling from stage and in the output stage, having the AI experts basically learn from the experts what that first stage should look like, and then having the experts look for prima facie validity and basically content sensibility on the back end. So not to feed into the hype as much, but just to say we found this is very useful in that northwest quadrant of the information review. As far as a use case goes, for instance, we've had cases where curated AI identifies newly published data from a competitor trial, and we've helped companies update their evidence generation strategy to include an electronic medical record study, for instance, on key outcomes from a trial. An existing indirect comparison is updated using these new data, for instance, to preempt or react to competitor strategy. So it's not the case that we couldn't do this before, but we become more efficient at it. And we also become more thorough because you can create these AI tools now that are always searching. Take some of the onus off the human. It's very important to align the evidence generation strategy with internal stakeholders' milestones. For instance, depending on which part of the life cycle, which phase you're in, making sure that you're aligned with the core evidence generation strategies are aligned with the pricing and reimbursement strategy, the preparation of HTA submissions, and making sure that your curated AI platform is keeping you up to date and helping you keep all of these streams and all of your stakeholders aligned and on the same page. When we're thinking about getting ready for joint clinical assessment in EU HTA, phase 2 is really at the core here. And basically, again, early evidence management tools will help you align depending on what content area you're in, make sure you're addressing the success factors that are gonna make you successful. My colleague Suzanne in the audience has spearheaded development of a database version for JCA dossier prep, early gap analysis, and mitigation strategy. And you can see the second bullet down on the right mentions a filtered, or what I'm calling a curated AI. Basically streamlines the intelligence development here, and again, taking some of the onus off the human. And finally, mock scientific advice, another element which my colleague Suzanne leads here on the European side, is another great tool that can be used. Now, the final topic I'll talk about is predicting reimbursement and price with greater speed and accuracy. And here, it's not like we haven't been doing analysis of analogs forever. What we found is that this curated AI approach really makes it a lot more efficient. The humans obviously have to be the ones defining the criteria, but once you've done that, these technologies make it so easy not only to populate, for instance, the colors in this table, but even the selection of products, which is great because these are time-consuming elements. They used to be time-consuming. Now they're becoming less so. Same thing with pricing scenarios. It's amazing now that these tools can even help you if you give these tools some basic parameters around cost effectiveness in the ICER. They can even help you generate price scenarios for economically justifiable prices, for instance, in a cost effectiveness country like the UK. Oh, and there's one more topic, sorry, which is communicating value through global value dossiers, health economic models, and so on. And again, what we're finding here, and you're probably seeing it in your own work and at conferences, is that AI is really helping to streamline things and just reduce the onus, again, on the humans, and just make the humans faster, not replace the humans, but just make the humans faster and more efficient and more comprehensive. So with that, I'll stop and ask if there are any questions or comments if people want to come up to the mic. Any questions? The moderator's supposed to have a question for the speaker, but I'm not going to ask myself a question. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Did you want to come up to, or? We have a small enough room if you want to speak from there.
Yeah, I think maybe it's okay without the microphone. Thanks from Otsuka. I just wondered, with the platforms that you described, how do you deal with accessing, for instance, published articles which are in a not free access environment? So, scientific journals which are behind a paywall, basically. Is there a way to manage that and still access the information in an appropriate way?
That's a great question. So what we've done with our platform is we've developed partnerships with the vendors that sell access to, for instance, just thinking about Poly is one for pricing information, HTA information, and so forth. So developing relationships so that you can have continuous access to these platforms. And then if you need to develop a contract with an Elsevier or whatever the publishing database is that provides access to these, it's not efficient to do it on an article by article basis, which I think is what you're getting at, because then it just slows everything down. So what we found is you have to develop sort of enterprise-wide partnership agreements with these publishing houses to basically have access when you need access.